Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're getting into something, well, it's a little different. We're diving into the world of government cheese.
A cheesy topic, you could say.
But
But seriously, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
exactly. We dug into some articles from Wikipedia Food and Wine, Modern Farmer, even Patch.com, and get this, we're talking about millions, billions of pounds of cheese.
That's a lot of cheddar.
It really is. But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics. What exactly is government cheese?
Well, imagine this. The government buys a ton of milk from dairy farmers.
Okay, to help them out, stabilize prices, right?
Exactly. But instead of, just giving away gallons of milk, they turn that milk into cheese. Lots and lots of cheese. It's processed, so think of it like the kind of cheese you might find in,
Not exactly fancy cheese plate material?
No, not quite. But it's shelf-stable and it lasts a long time. Anyway, this whole thing really gets going back in 1949 with the Agricultural Act.
Ah, government intervention in agriculture.
Right, see, milk prices, they can be all over the place, right? So this act, along with things like the Commodity Credit Corporation, aimed to help dairy farmers out. And one way they did that was by, dealing with all that surplus milk, turning it into cheese.
Clever solution. But fast forward a few decades, and suddenly it's the 1980s, and there's a mountain cheese, right?
Yeah, it's the 80s, leg warmers, shoulder pads, and way too much cheese.
So what happened? Did everyone just stop liking grilled cheese?
Well, there was a President Carter, who really wanted to help out those dairy farmers. So his administration raised the price supports for milk even more.
Seems like a good idea, right? Support the farmers.
In theory, yeah. But in practice, it meant farmers produced way more milk than people actually needed. Supply and demand,
Right, supply and demand. So what do you do with all that extra milk? You make cheese, of course.
Exactly. And that's when things got really cheesy. By 1984, there was so much government cheese, it was like 5 pounds per person.
5 pounds per person. That's a lot of cheesy casseroles.
Yeah, tell me about it. And now, imagine you're President Reagan, you've inherited this cheese mountain. What do? Dump it in the ocean. Not exactly a popular option.
Not to mention a huge waste.
Exactly. So they came up with a plan. Enter TFAP.
TFAP, I have to admit, I'm not familiar.
Stands for the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program. Basically, a way to get all that surplus cheese to people who really needed it. Food banks, schools, families struggling to put food on the table.
Okay, so TFAP, government cheese for the people. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But where do you even store that much cheese? I've heard rumors about, caves full of government cheese.
You're not imagining things. Those cheese caves are real. Or at least they were.
Wait, really? Tell me more about these cheese caves.
Well, picture this. Missouri, right? The cave state. It's practically got caves on tap. So naturally, when you've got a surplus of cheese the size of a small country, you find a cave to put it in.
Okay, but were they, actual caves? With, cheddar stalactites and stuff?
Well, maybe not stalactites, but these were massive climate-controlled spaces. Some of them were old limestone mines with ceilings so high you could drive a truck in there.
A cheesy spectacle for sure. But seriously, did those cheese caves ever actually exist? Or is this an urban legend?
They did exist, but that doesn't mean they're still around today, overflowing with government cheddar.
Wait, what? Are you saying there's no cheesy Indiana Jones adventure waiting to happen?
Not quite. See, a lot of those numbers you hear, like 1.5 billion pounds of cheese stashed away, that's mostly privately owned cheese. The USDA might store some, but those huge stockpiles from the 80s, they're not really a thing anymore.
Hold on, so no secret government cheese caverns. Bummer.
Maybe, maybe not. But remember those price supports we talked about? Those ended back in 2014, so the government's not buying up all that extra milk and making mountains of cheese anymore.
So things have changed in the cheese world. Less cheese, maybe, but that's probably a good thing, right? Less waste.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Government cheese, it's more than just a food. It's become this cultural icon. We're talking SNL skits, rap songs, even Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg were cooking with it.
You're right. It's true, government cheese has had quite the cultural impact. But it's also a reminder of some bigger issues, right?
Oh, absolutely. It really goes to show you, food is never just food, is it? There's always a bigger story there. And with government cheese, it's a story about, it's about a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned SNL, which is hilarious, right? But then there's the other side of it, government cheese as a lifeline for people.
Right, exactly. For some people, it brings back memories of tough times, having to rely on assistance to put food on the table was a safety net for a lot of families, a way to make sure kids didn't go hungry, school lunches, food banks. It played a big role there.
No doubt about it. And that's something that's important to remember. But at the same time, there's been criticism too, right? Like, isn't government cheese also seen as an example of government waste?
Oh, for sure. There's definitely that side of it, too. Critics would look at those mountains of surplus cheese and say, see, this is what's wrong with government programs. All that waste, all that expense, and for what?
A brick of processed cheese.
Exactly. It raised questions about how we treat people in need, too. Like, is this really the best we can do?
It's strange, right? How something as simple as cheese can become this symbol for all these bigger debates. We're talking about poverty, government programs, even what we consider to be good food.
It's true. And you see those different perspectives reflected in how people remember government cheese, too. Some people, they actually have fond memories of it. They'll talk about how well it melts, the taste.
Wait, really? Fond memory of government cheese?
I know, right? But for some people, it's tied to their childhood, their family history. Maybe it reminds them of tougher times, but not necessarily in a bad way.
Interesting. But I'm guessing not everyone feels that way.
Oh, definitely not. For other people, it represents the opposite. It's a reminder of the stigma they might have felt, having to rely on government assistance. It's bland, it's low quality, it's not something they look back on fondly.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from cheese caves to food insecurity, from 80s nostalgia to some really big questions about food and society. This is why I love these deep dives. But I have to ask, what's the big takeaway here? What's the point of all this cheese talk?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think this whole government cheese saga, it really highlights a few important things. First of all, it shows how even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. Remember President Carter? He wanted to help farmers, and he did, but it also led to this massive cheese surplus.
Right, a classic example of like supply and demand gone wrong.
Exactly, but it also shows just how complicated this whole system is, you know? We're talking about food production, government intervention, social welfare. How do you balance all of that? How do you make sure farmers get fair prices, but also that everyone has access to affordable, nutritious food?
It's a tough question. And it's not just about cheese, obviously.
Nope, not at all. It's about all of it. It's about hunger, food waste, even climate change. Because how we produce and distribute food, it has a ripple effect on everything else.
And sometimes it takes something as, well, as unexpected as government cheese to make those connections clear.
It really does. And honestly, I think it's a conversation that's more relevant now than ever. Think about it. Climate change, a growing population, more and more people facing food insecurity. We need to figure this out, and fast.
Yeah, maybe not with cheese caves though, right?
Probably not. Although, who knows? Maybe there's a place for a well-managed cheese reserve in the future. Stranger things have happened.
Okay, you got me there. But whether or not cheese caves make a comeback, one thing's for sure. This whole government cheese thing, it's a wild ride. And it's got us thinking about some pretty important stuff. That's an understatement. I feel like we've gone from zero to cheese whiz in like no time flat.
It's been a wild ride, that's for sure. Who knew government cheese could be so, well, so thought-provoking?
Right. You think you're just talking about cheese, but it turns out it's about so much more. But before we wrap things up here, I always like to leave our listeners with a little something to ponder, something to really chew on.
I like it. So cheese for thought, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So based on everything we've talked about today, all this cheesy goodness, what's one question that you think is worth thinking about?
That's a tough one. There's so much to unpack here. But I guess if I had to pick one question, it would be this. How do we as a society make sure everyone has enough to eat without, destroying the planet in the process?
That's a big one. And it's only getting bigger, right? Climate change, food insecurity.
Yeah.
These are huge challenges.
They really are. And it's not easy finding that balance between, supporting farmers and making sure food is affordable while also thinking about sustainability, the environment.
Right. It's complicated.
It is. But like we've seen with government cheese, even something as basic as cheese can be a window into these bigger issues. It's all connected.
Totally. Food, it's at the heart of so many things. It's essential, but it's also cultural. It brings people together. And yeah, sometimes it takes a deep dive into something like, government cheese to really appreciate all of that.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that cheesy note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Time to say cheese and wrap it up.
Perfectly cheesy. To all our listeners out there, thanks for coming along on this unexpectedly cheesy adventure. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.